Okay. Good evening. Thank you. Welcome to Rotary International. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is David Alexander. I'm the Chief Communications Officer at Rotary, and we really appreciate you participating in our event tonight. Today marks 432 days since Russia invaded Ukraine. Our prominent panelists tonight are going to brief us on the latest situation and what does it mean for Ukraine and for the world. Tonight's discussion is part of the Rotary Voices podcast series, which features interviews from thought leaders and people who are working to make our community stronger across the globe. This podcast is available, Rotary Voices is available wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll be taping a session tonight. For those of you who are not familiar with Rotary, we are 1.4 million members across the globe who are focused community leaders, people who are professionals, business leaders, community leaders, and others who are working to make our community stronger. And we're real pleased to have some members of Rotary here tonight and others. And our focus is really, as leaders, is to come together and take action to make our community stronger. Before I introduce our host, Steve Edwards, I want to acknowledge a few people. First, our president nominee, Stephanie Urchek, is here tonight, which is great. Thank you, Stephanie, for coming. And thank you to the Rotary Clubs of the greater Chicago area, in particular here in Evanston, who are here tonight. We also, of course, want to thank our partners and the members of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We have a few colleagues from Rotary International here. We have some members of the media, some contributors to the Rotary magazine, of course, members from the local community, and I notice a few friends of our Editor-in-Chief, Wen Wang, who are also here tonight. We're also joined by an audience via Zoom, either from Europe or other parts of North America. And for those of you who are on Zoom, you can submit your questions for our panelists via chat. We will be monitoring that chat when we get to the Q&A. I especially want to recognize our Rotary members who are on Zoom from New Hampshire. And these members have founded the Common Man for Ukraine project. They've raised more than $2.7 million for Ukraine with the help of, yeah, it's impressive. With the help of Rotary networks in Poland and in Ukraine, they've delivered tons of food, thousands of supplies, and hundreds of generators and other equipment, all to support either internally displaced or refugees who have either fled or have stayed and had to move in Ukraine. And using Rotary Connections, they've also helped to fund the Trauma and Counseling and Education Center just outside of Warsaw. And this is for refugees specifically who are children. It's a really impressive project, and it's one example of the work that Rotary is doing in response to this crisis. Now, our host, Steve Edwards. Steve is a former award-winning journalist, interviewer, and program host. In fact, I was talking to Steve. I remember when he was the host of NPR Chicago's 848 program. In fact, I pitched him a few stories way back. His work has appeared on BBC, Bloomberg News, numerous other public media outlets, including, of course, National Public Radio. And then from 2012 to 2017, Steve helped launch and lead the University of Chicago's Nonpartisan Institute of Politics. Steve is currently the Managing Director of Koya Partners. He's one of our contributors to the Rotary Voices podcast, and we're real pleased to have you here, Steve. I'm going to turn the program over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, David. David, thank you, and thanks to everybody here for braving a cold, dreary fall day to be with us here for this conversation in Evanston. In just a minute, I'll introduce our two guests. I did just want to underscore two aspects for this conversation for all of us. We will be going to you for your questions here at Rotary's headquarters here in Evanston, and for those of you who are watching via Zoom, we will be looking for your questions in the chat, as David just mentioned. I should also mention that we are going to be recording this for the Rotary podcast. If you haven't had a chance to subscribe to it, it's a podcast that features in-depth conversations and articles that are featured in Rotary magazine. So you're going to see in just a second a little bit of behind the scenes radio and audio magic as I sit here and read an intro in front of you, and hopefully don't stumble through it. And then we'll be off to our conversation. We'll talk a bit with our esteemed guests, Ivo Dalder and John Huco, and then open it up to you for conversations and reaction. So without further ado, if Yusu, are you ready for us? Okay, fantastic. All right, we will begin here in 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the podcast of Rotary Magazine, the official publication of Rotary International. I'm Steve Edwards. For this episode of the podcast, we are gathered before a live audience at Rotary International headquarters in Evanston, Illinois, to take stock of the war in Ukraine more than 1 year after it began. To help us make sense of the geopolitical and humanitarian impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we are joined by two experts. John Huco is the General Secretary and Chief Executive Officer of Rotary International and the Rotary Foundation. Earlier in his career, he was an international partner with the law firm of Baker & McKenzie, where he served as managing partner of its offices in Kyiv and Prague and advised on the initial draft of the Ukrainian Constitution in 1991. Also with us is Ivo Dalder, who's president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and host of the podcast World Review with Ivo Dalder. He served as the U.S. ambassador to NATO from 2009 to 2013. Prior to his appointment, he was a senior fellow in foreign policy studies at the Brookings Institution. He also served as director for European Affairs and President Bill Clinton's National Security Council staff from 1995 to 1997. He's the author of numerous books, including most recently with James Lindsay, The Empty Throne, America's Abdication of Global Leadership. Please join me in welcoming both John and Ivo to this important conversation. It's really good to be with you both. And John, let me start with you. The war in Ukraine for you is personal and deeply impactful in more ways than one. Why so?
First of all, thank you so much, Steve, for agreeing to moderate this panel, and and to Ivo for coming. I know you've got a very busy schedule. I'm just off the plane from Ukraine, so appreciate both of you being here with us. But yes, for me, Ukraine is personal. My parents are both from Ukraine. They came to the United States in 1949 after the war, having fled Ukraine as the Soviet army was advancing. Spent 5 years in a refugee camp, displaced persons camp in southern Germany, and then came to the United States to Detroit. So it's something that sort of I've grown up with, both the language and the culture, and also had the opportunity to live and work in Ukraine in those early years of independence. My wife Marga is from Argentina, and we were married in Santa Fe in Argentina, and literally 2 weeks later moved to Moscow at the end of 1989 to go and open up the office for the law firm that I was working with. And we were there for about a year and a half, and then I had the opportunity to move to Ukraine in 1991, funded by George Soros to work for a year as a legal advisor in the Ukrainian parliament. So I was fortunate enough to be there for independence in the Ukrainian parliament building when Ukraine became independent, and work on a lot of the initial legislation, the constitution, et cetera. So then practiced law for a number of years, and then at the end Marga said, you know, we got to head a little bit further west. So I moved to Prague and then eventually back to the United States. Yes, it's something that's very near to dear to me, and of course, terrible tragedy to see what's unfolding in Ukraine today.
Before we bring it forward to the present day, I just want to stay in those experiences that you were talking about in the early 90s and the fall of the Soviet Union, the independence that Ukraine achieved through the constitution that you helped draft. As you recall those days, what do you remember most about the spirit and the complexity and the possibilities of those times?
It's obviously a very heady time, right? Because it was always the Soviet Union. Who would have imagined that the Soviet Union could possibly have fallen? If you had asked someone the week before the coup in August 1991, the Soviet Union, in effect, would be over within a couple of weeks, you would have thought, people would have thought you would have been crazy. But you know, for me, what I most remember in some ways is, you know, Andy Warhol says that you have every person has their 15 minutes in the sun, and mine sort of happened in Ukraine in 1991. As you know, the coup happened on the 19th of August of '91 in Moscow, and the day before, Marga and I were in a town called Zaporizhia, which you read about in the news quite a bit now. It's really close to the nuclear power plant. At a rock concert. There have been a whole series of rock concerts that have been developed during the Perestroika times. And so we were there for that rock concert, and we were walking along the river, the Dnipro River, which runs through the city. I was with a Ukrainian lawyer who I wound up hiring when I opened the Baker McKenzie office. And I turned to him and I said, Alexei, this is absolutely extraordinary. Here I am, you know, son of bourgeois nationalists. That's what the Soviets called my parents in that generation that fled. I've got an ID card with a hammer and sickle on it. I have open access to the Parliament building, to the Ministry of the various ministries, etc. There has to be some sort of counter-revolution that's going to happen. I can't imagine this is going to be allowed to continue. So we flew back to Kyiv that night. The next morning, on the 19th, I get a phone call at 7 in the morning, and it's Alexei, and he says, John, do you remember what we talked about yesterday? I said, I sure do. So turn on the TV. Turned it on. Coup had happened. All these declarations from the junta, and then Swan Lake, and all that stuff that was going on the television. So then I headed over and spent the 3 days of the coup in the Ukrainian Parliament building, sort of a real inside story in terms of what exactly was happening. And so on the 21st, Yeltsin gets on the tank in Moscow, pretty much at the end of the beginning of the end of the coup. And then the question then was, how was Ukraine going to react to the events that happened in Moscow? And the parliament was out of session at that time. And so they called it for the 24th of August. And so the night of the 23rd, the Democratic opposition in the parliament got together on the third floor of the parliament building, and they only had about 25% of the deputies at the time. What are we going to do tomorrow? And they were divided between one group that said, let's go for independence, and another group that said, we don't want to be independent with the communists running the country, because they had the majority in the parliament. And for me, listening and watching all that, it's sort of like being in Philadelphia on July 2nd or 3rd, and Jefferson talking about, you know, what's the Declaration of Independence going to look like. And in the end, they decided to go for independence the next day. So they began drafting all these different decrees that they wanted the parliament to approve. And, nationalizing communist property, depoliticizing the KGB, a number of political prisoners that need to be released, etc. And they're drafting away. And then one of the deputies comes up to me and says, John, we got a problem. And I said, what is it? He goes, we have no way of photocopying these things. And I said, well, just go to the photocopiers were very rare at the time. I said, well, just go to the Secretariat. I knew they had a good copying machine there. And they said, no, they're run by the communists. The Secretariat is run by the communists. They'll never let us photocopy this stuff. And I said, okay, why don't you give me all these things? And Marga had just brought back a box of A4 paper from Moscow. So on this little Canon PC-7, I and a student from the university spent all night doing 435 copies of all these things. And I'm reading things, I'm going, this is history right here being in the making. And we didn't have enough paper to do one per page, so we had to put 4 on a page. And I showed up at 7 in the morning with all this stuff. I handed it to the deputy head of the opposition. Communists freaked out, like, where did all this stuff come from? And 6 hours, Ukraine declared independence. So I'm sure they would have declared it without my photocopying acumen. But I think it certainly made me feel that I played a small, interesting role in Ukraine becoming independent. So, that's my Andy Warhol story.
I love that story. So here we are, almost a quarter century later. And Ivo, I want to get you in on this, but to stay one more with you, John, a quarter century later, what is it like for you to witness the war and destruction taking place now?
I think just as any human being, it's just absolutely extraordinary, the destruction, the brutality, I mean, you were just there and you saw it firsthand. I mean, yes, the country's rebounding, and I think your impression of Kyiv was it's very, very vibrant. But if you look at the death and destruction that's been happening, it's absolutely mind-bending, right? Hundreds of thousands of buildings destroyed, over 1,000 hospitals destroyed, universities, museums, cultural artifacts, let alone the death and destruction happening from the war, apartment buildings. It goes on and on. And so I never imagined that in today's world that certainly that the Russians would be capable of something that brutal. So it hurts on a personal level. I have a great deal of family and friends still in Ukraine. It's tough. It's tough. But I've also admired the Ukrainians. Absolutely extraordinary, their reaction, what they've done, and how they've been able to beat back really the second largest army in the world with basically a scorched earth policy in terms of Russia's approach to the war.
Ivo, John just mentioned, you were there just a couple of days ago, right? What struck you the most about, you were in Kyiv for not quite a couple of days, right?
Yeah, 36 hours. What struck me the most is, on the one hand, we have the very real image that John talked about. A country destroyed in one form or another, from little villages to humongous towns, frankly leveled by indiscriminate bombardments, by what can only be called terrorist acts by one state against another. You see the fighting on the television screens, or you read about it in the papers or on the internet, that is happening on a day-to-day basis. And then you take a train, which runs on time, from Poland to Kyiv. It takes 10 hours. It's actually quite comfortable. I slept 8 of them. Not bad for a normal night's sleep. And you arrive in Kyiv station, and it's like arriving in any European train station. There are people all over the place. They're either taking trains or coming out of trains. You look at the board, and there's trains to Kharkiv, to Kherson, all to Odessa, all over the place. The trains are all doing what they're supposed to do. You turn on your phone, you have 4G. The stores are full. Most remarkable thing, window displays that were showing summer clothing in department stores. In the middle of a war, you wouldn't just get that. Traffic is horrendous. Cars are everywhere. People are everywhere. Restaurants are full. The Wi-Fi works. Electricity works. Everything works. Cranes, the strangest thing I never thought I would see. There is building going on in Kyiv at a level that you wouldn't have thought of possible, like it's China or something. And it's not just rebuilding the buildings that have been destroyed. It's building the city and modernizing and making it real. And so only there for 36 hours, but in 36 hours you get a sense of the resilience of the people. And we know about this, and you see it, and you read about it. But the real resilience that they have, and let me just a story. The night we were there, the night that we slept there, was the first time in 51 days that the Russians launched missile attacks on Kyiv. Every hotel, like every place, has a basement in which you go and ride out the attack. And as it happened, none of the missiles hit Kyiv. They were all intercepted. Unfortunately, some were not intercepted and hit a neighboring town, which killed over 20 people, including 8 kids. So just to remind you of the horror of the war. But the first meeting we had was with a young woman who we asked, so how was this for you? And she said, oh, I mean, we've been totally used to it. Let me tell you, when the war happened, I and my 2 kids went to Italy, stayed with a friend, and after about 4 months, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to come back. And came back, brought my kids back. My husband was a shooter. He's now in Bakhmut, where he's a sharpshooter. He was off for 3 months, but he's back on service. And when the air raid sirens came, I said, I'm not going to wake up my kids. They have to go to school tomorrow. they'll figure out a way to get through it. In fact, they slept through it, so they'd never heard of it. And that's resilience. Air raid science in the middle of the night, and you let your kids sleep, in part because they were used to the fact that this is happening a lot, that defenses are better than they are. And husband on the front line, and she is now running an amazing platform where she's trying to get startups to work together with larger industries to meet military needs in the production and communication side. 29 years old with all that responsibility, and very happy to be doing it. So that was my impression. A country that Vladimir Putin tried to destroy its spirit, and instead it has come back with a spirit and a unity and a desire for wanting to stand up that won't go away. And that means that for all practical purposes, Vladimir Putin has already lost the war, despite the fact that all of the destruction, which will continue and is continuing and probably will continue for a long time, and the suffering that comes with it has happened. But at the deep psychological and political level, he never had a chance because the Ukrainian people would not give him a chance.
I want to build on that. We'll think about this conversation in a couple of chunks, and I don't want to leave the humanitarian impact here, but just to follow up on your point there. Long before this invasion, Russia's obviously been in Ukraine, has been seized territory previously. Crimea has been manipulating Ukrainian politics for a long time, commerce, etc. Ukrainian politics were deeply divided. So the outcome that has happened is not necessarily an outcome that would have been obviously predicted. Is that fair to say?
It's absolutely fair to say.
Both on the part of the Russian challenges and also how Ukrainians respond.
Yeah, so I think it's, number one is that we need to stop talking about that this is a war that is only in day 431. This is the 10th year of war. This war started in February of 2014. And at that point, the Russians, first in Crimea, in a pretty remarkable military operation, but then with the kind of destruction that we have seen as well in the Donbass, took and seized territory and started a long form of destruction. And it gets to the core of what this conflict is about. In my view, this is not about territory. It's not about who owns what piece of land. It's about what happens to the future of Ukraine. Moscow, Vladimir Putin, wants to make sure that it gets to decide the future of Ukraine. And for some strange reason, the Ukrainians actually would like to decide their own future by themselves. Now, it's actually strange because as one person I talked to, a very seasoned intelligence official in Ukraine, said, when we talked about where were the mistakes made in this war, he said, first of all, we got extremely lucky. It was good that we had intelligence from the United States that something might be happening, so we were able to react and disperse some forces, particularly their air forces, early on. But we were also lucky because Putin, and he actually thought it was Putin more than anyone else, miscalculated and thought that he could repeat what the Soviet Union had done in Prague in 1968, where 500,000 troops invaded Czechoslovakia, took control of the airfields, and was able to topple the Dubček regime, the regime that had started the Prague Spring, frankly, without firing much of a shot. And he thought he could do the same thing. He miscalculated that the Ukrainians were going to, one, resist, but two, would know what that plan was because, frankly, the Americans had given the plan. But if he had done one of two things, if he had only concentrated only on the east and the south, had bypassed Kharkiv rather than try to level it, he would have taken 20–25% of Ukraine, and it would have been very, very difficult for the Ukrainians to get it back. In fact, he did primarily do that, and he still has a large part of that chunk of territory. Secondly, if he had not invaded, in the second tranche in February, but just kept 200,000 troops. Ukrainian society was getting deeply divided. It was dividing about whether or not it should provide more concessions or less concessions to the Russians, about whether it should change some of the provisions of the Constitution with regard to minority rule, etc. And those divisions he could have exploited if he had been smart, to the point that Ukraine might have suffered in some ways, or it wouldn't have come apart, but in which Russian influence could have been extended. Instead, what he did is he did a frontal assault against Ukraine, and the one thing that did is it took every Ukrainian, Russian-speaking, Ukrainian-speaking, wherever they lived, and made them anti-Russian, to hate Russia, and that's what unified the country
and pushed and closer to the West.
So that becomes a second sort of question of where does Ukraine go, and we can talk about that as a different sense. But it was a very interesting perspective that the kind of strategic miscalculation that we've talked about in the Russians was such that we got pretty darn close to losing this one. The world, and most importantly, the Ukrainians, if only they had been smarter. Now, the reality is they wouldn't be smarter because they want to control all of Ukraine. And as long as Russia wants to control all of Ukraine, Ukraine is going to say, no, don't think so. We want to control our own fate. And that's what this war is all about. Who gets to control the fate of Ukraine? It's not about the Donbass. It's not about Crimea. It's not about some particular piece of territory anywhere. It's about who gets to say and has the ultimate say. And that's, in many ways, is why the Russians have already lost, because we know who's going to get the ultimate say. It's going to be Ukrainians, not the people in Moscow.
John, you have said that it's important to put this in a broader historical context. So what's your sense of what this war means to Ukraine and the people of Ukraine?
I think Ivo's absolutely correct that this war has completely backfired on Putin. And if you look at the sort of trajectory of development of Ukraine as a country, if you look back to '91 at independence, and it was a divided country in terms of language, religion, historical background. Western Ukraine, historically part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Before that, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Eastern Ukraine, obviously part of the Russian Empire, etc. So it was still it existed as a territory, and what's ironic here is that you can kind of thank Stalin for that. It's sort of interesting, the guy who murdered 66 million Ukrainians in the famine in the 30s really took the final step in building a Ukrainian territory, so to speak. And then you had sort of the bad years of Kuchma after independence, and then came the Orange Revolution, where Ukraine became solidified much more as a country. Then you had, obviously, Maidan in 2014, and I think that did act, Ivo, to bring Ukrainians much, much closer together, particularly after the Crimean invasion and the territories in Donbass that Russia took. But it was still, to your point, a lot of ambivalence about West, East, etc., a lot of internal discussions, and then this war came. And it's completely backfired on him. And so exactly what he didn't want to have happen has actually happened. I think part of it is, if you look at it back historically, and I think this is something that's been underappreciated in the West when we try to understand both Russia and Ukraine, is that unless Russia has Ukraine, it's lost about 400 years of its history. You look at sort of any history book, history of Russia. It starts with Kiev and the Rush. I'm sorry, I'm going to get very academic here, but it's really important to Putin's psyche and the psyche of the Russians. The Kiev and the Rush, which was an empire that existed in the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, the Russians consider that their history. That's their history all the way up to the present day. It's difficult to claim that history when Kiev is the capital of a country called Ukraine that doesn't speak Russian but speaks Ukrainian, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a deep historical, psychological issue that the Russians are dealing with this whole issue of an independent Ukraine. And you couple that with someone like Putin, who, if you read his essay in July of 2020, where he basically comes out and says, Ukrainian is not a language, not a people, it's a fiction of, Western intrigue or whatever, you set the stage for these kinds of miscalculations that he did. And if you think that the Ukrainians aren't a people, of course you think you're going to be able to waltz into Kyiv and do that. But I perhaps would disagree with you a little bit in that Kyiv is important for him. Because without Kyiv, they lose that enormous historical trajectory that they think is theirs, which the Ukrainians, of course, claim is theirs. So I think it goes beyond just NATO, certainly NATO, and there's some deep psychological, historical roots to this conflict. But what has happened is that it's completely backfired on him. As you said, Ivo, the Ukrainians are united. They've taken, in my view, the penultimate step in building a true nation. And what's ironic here is Stalin created the Ukrainian territory, and in a way, Putin took those final steps to create a unified Ukrainian nation. Very ironic. Two of Ukraine's greatest enemies over the last 100 years have probably done more than anyone to accelerate Ukrainian national development.
You know, there's been so much speculation about both how long will this war last, what would an end game look like, and we can talk more about that as we go forward. But the story you tell, John, and providing that history also makes me think, Ivo, that, you know, both in terms of the actions and the stakes for Putin's own power domestically and his standing in the world, not to mention historical ties that John was just talking about, that Putin's got to go all in and got to double down, and that the prospects for peace or backing off or any sort of change in strategy would have him lessening the direction that he set forth more than a year ago seems highly implausible. What's your read on it?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, in some ways, I think this war, and certainly the conflict that underlies the war, is not going to end, even if Ukraine were to able to retake all the territory within its 1991 borders. The conflict won't be over. The fighting will have stopped for a while, but Russia will still find the opportunity, or try to find the opportunity, to get what it wants, which is to control the destiny of Ukraine, physically or politically, or preferably both. So I agree with you that he had to go to Kyiv at some point. The question was, how do you do that strategically? But it is about the control of Ukraine, which is both a Russian traditional destiny, the idea that security inheres in empire as opposed to in having neighbors who feel secure, which is how we tend to think about security. And it's a deeply Russian perspective, but it is a Putinist, not only Putin, but Putinism perspective as well, that Ukraine and Belarus and Russia and Moldova and most of Poland actually belong to the Russian Empire, and that it has to be run by and for and at the behest of Moscow. That's not going to go away. It's not going to go away when Putin goes away. It only goes away when Russian society finds that it can achieve what it needs by recognizing the security of its neighbors rather than its own insecurities, and that's a long way from here. So we have to deal with this country, not even this empire that sits in this particular part of Europe, and provide for the security, help Ukraine provide for the security of Ukraine. That's when the war ends, not whether we give them F-16s or M1A1 tanks. It's this whole debate in Washington, which is about how many tanks and bullets and everything can you give to Ukraine, is important because there's a war going on that needs to be fought. But it's not the end. And it's not that this is going to lead to peace. There's a big counteroffensive coming. Let's say it succeeds. Let's say it throws the Russians completely out. You don't have peace at that point. You just have a new situation in the conflict. And that's how we need to start thinking about this. It isn't about territory. It's about who gets to decide the future of Ukraine. And Ukraine being part of the West, we'll talk about more, is the core of how you end this conflict. To tell Putin that whatever he wants, he ain't going to get it, because the cost of doing so is too large, even for Russia. That's where we need to go.
John, you want to get in?
Maybe if I could just push back a bit, or at least offer perhaps an alternative thought. I think it's both territory and the future of Ukraine. I think they're somewhat intertwined. If you look at let's say Germany after the Second World War, it did a profound thinking about itself. It looked in the mirror and said, how did we as a nation cause so much death and destruction? And you had this never again, and a really rethinking of German psyche and society. That's never happened in Russia. After the fall of the Soviet Union, they never stepped back and said, gee, many Christmas, what did we do here? How did we, and they ran the Soviet Union, their culture, their language, they dominated. That never happened. In fact, when you talk to Russians in 91, 92, they're like, these ungrateful republics that broke away, we were the real victims in the Soviet Union. So for me, to answer the long-term security issue, and perhaps it's a controversial statement, we need regime change in Russia. And the only way, in my view, that's going to happen is the defeat that Putin faces has to be so great that not even his extraordinary propaganda machine can spin it differently to the Russian people. If you watch Russian TV, and I watch quite a bit of it, the level of propaganda, the lying, the obfuscation, it's mind-bending. And you watch that for 3 or 4 days, and you start saying, maybe he's got a point here. And the Russians have been having this for the last 15 years. The Ukrainians say the zombification of the Russian people. So it's going to jar loose that examination in the mirror that the Germans went through. And so, Ivo, I get what you're saying in a way, but the Ukraine, in my view, at least needs to get back to February 23rd. Crimea, the 2 Donbas areas in 14, I would agree with you there. That for me wouldn't be as critical. But the defeat has to be large enough that not even Russian propaganda, not even that zombified population that they have, can take a view other than, holy smokes, this isn't what we thought it would be. Because ultimately we do need, in my view, significant change in Russia, because that's going to result in the long-term security from an imperialistic, revanchist, ever-expanding country that has these imperial ambitions to one that wants to be part of the civilized European community. And in my view, that can only happen when you have significant regime change and also a deep introspection by Russian society. That'll only occur with a defeat, in my view.
Yeah, so I agree with that, but I don't think that moving the territorial lines 100 kilometers here or there is going to do that. Because I actually don't think that Putin is unique for Russia. I think he in fact, represents just a particularly bad form of how this country has conceived of its own security. And so I don't think that regime change is going to make a fundamental difference. In the short term, I think regime change is more likely to lead to people who believe that he has been too restrained in the way the war has been fought. And that is where the criticism is coming from Putin. And in some ways, he has been constrained. He could do a lot worse, even with conventional capabilities than he has done so far. One of the reasons that Kyiv is, as I described, is because it hasn't been leveled, say, with a nuclear weapon or a chemical weapon, or in a massive missile barrage that he could have done if he wanted to. So, which many people are calling for on their side. So
why hasn't he done that strategically here?
Because in some ways he's been deterred by us. He is calculating in the same way that Joe Biden is calculating what is it that I can do to help the Ukrainians that does not lead to the possibility of a direct military confrontation with Russia. He is calculating what can I get away with before I have a direct military confrontation with the United States, which he knows he'll lose, or NATO. So there's a calculation going on at the same time. This is not an all-out war. It's an all-out war for the Ukrainians because it is existential, and which is why everyone is part of this war. But it's not an all-out war for the Russians. It's not even called a war. It's a special military operation for reasons that have to do with the inability politically to mobilize the society and to mobilize the economy to the extent necessary. That said, he is clearly on the losing end, and he needs to find a way to justify the sacrifices that are being made, which will be long term. But I'm pessimistic about regime change as a solution to this problem. I think the way you ultimately need to change is the way we thought about it during the Cold War, which is that to make it impossible for them to achieve what they're trying to achieve militarily, politically, or economically, and to generate the internal forces of change that did lead to Gorbachev and led to when you were there, the kind of changes that we were then seeing, which were squandered. And partly we can look at what we did in the 1990s to help the Russians squander that opportunity. But it wasn't inevitable that in 1990 you were going to end up where we ended up today. And it may be that if you can generate that internal opposition over time, as George Kennan talked about in his famous long telegram in 1947, we can generate that over time as well. But that's going to take decades. It's not going to happen by how many kilometers we're going to move the front line. No, that's it. I want to move that front line as far to the place that it can possibly be. I would like to see these guys not just getting a bloody nose, but a hell of a lot more, and they deserve every bit of it. But it isn't clear to me that that's the key to how to think about this conflict. I think there's a more strategic and political part to it that accompanies the military part. And if maybe on CNN and MSNBC, and there's this other thing that people also watch, if we had less military generals talking about what the latest movement is of this artillery cell or of that, and more about what's this war about? Why does Putin think what he thinks? Why is the propaganda that we're seeing so effective inside Russia today? I think we'll have a better sense of how we might be able to figure out that this conflict ends, and it ends by the Ukrainians being able to choose their own destiny, which they want to be in the West, and we should open them up, open arms.
I want to make sure that folks here who have questions know that we'll be coming to you here in just a second. And those of you who are watching on Zoom, if you haven't already, we invite you to put your questions into the chat, and then we will, hopefully those will filter up this way so we can pose them to both John and Ivo. A quick follow-up though, Ivo, and John, by all means, weigh in too. You said a second ago that, you were making the Cold War analogy, and that the way to actually fundamentally change Russian behavior is across multiple modes, politically, economically, militarily, draw such a clear line, make the stakes so high that essentially you're in a different kind of containment strategy, right? What does that look like today? I mean, we had mutually assured destruction that dominated the Cold War and other.
Oh, no, it was more than that. I mean, so there was no trade between the East and the West.
Yeah.
And I think our economic attempt to isolate Moscow economically is a key part of your containment strategy. Those who thought that cutting them out of the international financial system and having the Europeans end their dependence on fossil fuels would somehow torpedo the Russian economy in 12 months didn't understand how the economics works. But here's some interesting things. Russian gas production exports totally is down 50% from a year ago, and is going to go down another 50% next year. That's a huge impact. Russian oil revenues are down more than 50%, and are likely to continue to go down by another 25% in 2020 and 2023. So the mainstay of the Russian economy is in deep, deep trouble. So you need that. You need political isolation, not just UN votes, but you need to make sure that it is impossible for Russians to be represented in Wimbledon, at the Olympics, and best of all, the World Cup and the European Cup soccer, because that's actually what people really care about in this part of the world, and isolate them that politically. Find ways to convince India and the Brazils and the South Africas, as well as the Chinas, to, if they don't want to condemn what the Russians are doing, at least not to help them to the extent that they are doing it. That's part of your containment strategy. And yes, help the Ukrainians win this war on the battlefield. But then the most important thing of a containment strategy is to make it impossible for Ukraine to become part of any Russian sphere of influence. And you do that by making Ukraine part of the European Union, and ultimately to have the security through an organization like NATO. If it is not NATO, I'm happy to be NATO, but some form of security guarantees that makes it impossible for Russia to think about the incorporation of Ukraine in the same way that it is impossible for them to think about the reincorporation of any of the Baltic states, or indeed as of countries like Finland. That's where Ukraine wants to go, and why, in God-forsaken name, would we want them to be part of it? But after everything that Ukraine has demonstrated it's able to do, Our security is certainly served by having Ukraine's part of who we are. It means reforming. It means helping to find justice reform. It means dealing with corruption, which is still endemic and deep in the society. But those are the kinds of steps that we can take over time. And then what is Russia going to do? Then ultimately you hope there's change like we saw in the 80s in the Soviet Union that would be real in 2030, 2080, 2040, whenever it is that the Russians come to their senses.
I don't want to lose out, John, without having you sort of weigh in on this direction as well. What's your sense of what Ivo just said?
I mean, if I could just, again, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but return back to this territory thing. I think, Ivo, you're right in a certain way, but at the end of the day, for the Ukrainians, territory matters. It's their country. They've lost it. And I completely agree with you. We need to help them to make sure they conquer as much as they can before any sort of stalemate gets to the point where, Western aid dries up or, the sort of parties are forced to the negotiating table. But I think there's also the kind of the precedent that this sets, right? I mean, if Russia were to get additional territory beyond what they had in 2014, what's the precedent we're setting? Sure, you didn't get everything you wanted, Putin, but you got something, and then maybe 10 years from now you can come back and take a second bite at the apple. So I think...
So John, don't misunderstand.
Yeah, sure.
Because Ukraine exists within 1991 borders, and that's it. I am not advocating, nor I think should anybody advocate for anything less than that. But it doesn't mean that it has to be achieved militarily today, or even tomorrow. We never recognized the incorporation of the Baltic states in the Soviet Union. It took 50 years for them to be independent, but in the end, they were independent. We never recognized until 1970, because the West Germans did, East Germany as an independent country. We didn't recognize North Korea. But that war is still ongoing. So there are many territorial places that we don't recognize as being final, that there is a political, hopefully a political and not a military solution. And yet, it doesn't mean that unless you militarily reconquer all pieces of territory, you haven't achieved what you're achieving. What I'm saying is, you reconquer everything in 1991, this conflict is still going on.
Right.
And so let's think about how you solve that part of it. So it's not either or, it's both.
Fair enough. I think the only thing I would add to that is that I'm not sure the Korean analogy, for example, is fully apt in Ukraine, because you have on both sides of the DMZ, same language, same culture, obviously 70 years of difference. It's obviously those societies have evolved differently. What would happen in Ukraine, and my fear would be if you had sort of a line of contact, DMZ, 10% of what Russia, then what's going to happen in the real world? Putin will eliminate, or Russia will eliminate any vestiges of anything Ukrainian in the territories east of that line. They'll import, as they've done in Crimea, hundreds and thousands, if not millions of Russians into that area. And yes, we may not have formally recognized it. Yes, Ukraine still has a claim on it, et cetera, but Russia will, and they will do this, they're doing this in Crimea, create such a big hedgehog that even if there were to be a change in Russia, and even if there were a diplomatic opportunity for Ukraine to get the east of that line, it's going to be Russia, ethnically, culturally, religiously, the whole 9 yards. So what is it that Ukraine's going to reincorporate? If you have a unification of the Koreas, still the same people, same history, same language. It's somewhat of a different dynamic. And from the Ukrainians, that's a danger, because they will, in effect, for all practical purposes, over a 20-year DMZ situation, that'll become Russia in every sense of the word, which will make it very difficult for Ukraine to reincorporate it.
Anyway, I mean, even Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania didn't become really Russian in the 50 years that the Soviet Union occupied.
Lithuanians are ethnically Estonians differently.
I don't want to overlook, though, the piece of this around culture and around humanitarian impact. We've been talking a lot about geopolitics, and there's plenty more to talk about: counteroffensive, the leaks of the military documents, et cetera. But I'm going to stop because I'd love to get questions from you on any topic under the sun as it relates to this. And see, do we have a microphone that will go around by chance? See, we have a hand up back here in our audience, and then we have two back there, and then one down here, and one over there. So let's see. Why don't we start? We'll start here because the mic's close, but if we can get a microphone over to this woman here who is in the pink and blue, with her hand up. Yeah. So we'll start.
Hi, my name is Rich, and I'm with the Rotary Club of Naperville. And I was very fortunate to go to the Peace Conference at the Rotary Convention last year and see some really excellent presentations by Rotarians from Ukraine on the peace-building efforts that they had been doing with Rotarians in Russia. All of that unfortunately stopped as continued communication between the two groups after the war broke out really put the security of the Rotarians in Russia at risk. They could be arrested by their government for talking to Ukrainians. But it was interesting at the end, they said, what's the right thing to do to try and promote peace in the near term? And the advice the Ukrainians gave was to try and hold conversations with the Russian diaspora, those Russians spread out throughout the world that are not in Russia. And I admit that I have some conflict with that because when you see this continued bombing of civilians and apartment buildings and that sort of thing, you start to say, why do we continue to allow the Russian citizens to freely travel throughout the world? Why don't we send them back home and let them try and help deal with the situation from the inside? So I'd be interested in your insights. Why should Russian citizens still be allowed to freely travel in countries in the West and not be, sent back home and close that border with them?
So they're not allowed to freely travel in the countries of the West. Most countries have now instituted visa requirements, which make it more difficult for Russians to travel. That includes Finland, which was the one gateway into it. There are many parts of the world, of course, where they can freely travel. Turkey, not a member of the European Union. Cyprus, member of the European Union. There's a small disagreement about it. You don't see a lot of Russians coming here on vacation anymore in the way that they used to, or even into London. So I think we're already trying to deal with that issue. You also have to deal with the reality that you don't know who's coming. Some of these people may be trying to escape the political repression that is engaged, that is happening in their own country, and how do you make that distinction and make sure that you remain a country or a place of refuge for those who are, for political or other reasons, need to leave the country. So I think it's hard to say that, let's just keep all Russians and do sort of a collective guilt part of it to make that a central way to think about it. At the same time, parts of the diaspora may be helpful to understand what kind of levers you may have in order to affect Russian society and therefore Russian behavior. And so engagement in that sense might well make sense. But I don't think we're going to solve this problem by shutting our borders to Russians to come. I think it's going to be deeper than that.
We have a question here, and then on the left side, there was a hand up in the back. We can go take the microphone.
Hi, my name is Nell. Thanks very much for doing this. It's very fascinating. My question is, to what extent do you see the Ukrainian situation flowing over into the other Eastern European countries that are in the current Russian sphere of influence? And to what extent do you see their populations and or their governments starting to at all push back on this kind of Russian idea of empire? And do you think that that is a pathway to breaking down what Putin sees as the future that he wants to create?
So I think the society that is closest to being incorporated in Russia, Belarus, is demonstrating, at least at the societal level, that they're not interested in it, and is actually putting some brakes on the capacity of Lukashenko, the president of that was in quotation marks for the podcast of Belarus to fully support Russia. What he's doing, for example, it's very clear that the Russians would like Belarusian forces to be part of the war. While they've allowed the territory to be used, the forces haven't been used. I don't see a lot of Poles wanting to be part of the Russian Empire. I think it's probably pretty limited in Moldova, though there's some who probably are okay with it. Turns out that probably the further away you are from Russia, the more likely it is you have pro-Russian
points of view. We have them in the United States. They used to be on that other channel that some people seem to watch, although less so because the guy who was most pro-Russian is no longer working for them. Thank you, Mr. Carlson. I mean, there's sympathy for Russia in one form or another, but I think the reality is, and this is where Ukraine is the big lesson, there were people inside Ukraine up to this invasion who had the relatively positive views of Russia, may not wanted to be part of Russia, but had relatively positive views. They're gone, literally gone. They've either left, the four of them who decided that they needed to go to Russia, or they've become Ukrainian in all but name, even though they don't speak Ukrainian, they only speak Russian. They are as Ukrainian as a Ukrainian can be. I think, as John rightly said, Putin has achieved the impossible. He's given Ukraine a national identity that it lacked up to this point, at least the depth of that identity that it lacked up to this point. My sense is the Poles and the Balts and the Latvians and the Moldovans and others are going to have exactly the same reaction to the attempt, should it come. Unlikely to come because the Ukrainians are preventing it. John, what's your take on these things?
I agree completely with what Ivo has said, and it's even, I think, if you can take it a step further, look at the unity that NATO and the EU have demonstrated in the face of this war. Nobody would have thought prior to the invasion that there would be this kind of unity. Look at countries like Bulgaria, Serbia, which have had historically very close ties to Russia, stepping back, and news reports of Bulgaria secretly having helped Ukraine and unexpectedly in Serbia and all that sort of thing. So I think that Ivo's absolutely right. This has been a wake-up call for people. And frankly, it's a clarion call that the Baltics and the Poles have been, and the Ukrainians and the Americans, to a certain extent, have been calling in Europe for a long time about concerns about the German-French Ostpolitik with Putin and Russia, and getting themselves into an economic model that was dependent on cheap Russian gas, cheap credit, cheap Eastern European labor, basically free security from the United States in some ways, and then exporting high margin stuff to China. And it's a model and an engagement that they thought would work. It didn't. It failed, and I think it's brought Europe closer together than ever. And I also agreed with what you said earlier about the absolutely critical importance of Ukraine joining NATO and joining the EU for a number of reasons. The NATO piece, they've shown that they definitely have, they can be a part of NATO. Actually, they're teaching NATO quite a bit in terms of war and strategy coming out of this war. It's going to have one of the probably the most experienced army in Europe after this war ends. And then EU accession is extraordinarily important because we had talked earlier, you mentioned about the need for dealing with corruption and all that. And so I said earlier that this war was a penultimate step in the development of Ukraine as a people. They need to take that last final, and that is to finally root out this corruption, finally deal with the rule of law issues, finally break up this oligarchic economic system that they had. And that's why EU accession is extraordinarily important, because that is an incredible carrot to force through these much needed reforms. And it can't be 25 years, like Macron said. It's got to be like 7, 8, it's got to be some kind of a reasonable period that's achievable. And similarly with NATO. And the second piece of it is we need to utilize, in my view, the reconstruction money. We're talking, I think the World Bank just came out with an analysis, $411 billion is what Ukraine's going to need. That's twice Ukraine's GDP. If you extrapolated that out to the United States, if we had a similar degree of destruction and rebuilding that's needed, it's something like $46 trillion that we would need for reconstruction. So Ukraine badly needs that help afterwards. How they're going to get it, where they're going to get it from is a massive challenge. But whatever they get, in my view, we need to really play with some tough love. Tell the Ukrainians, you deserve it, you need it, but the quid pro quo is you've got to finally deal with all these corruption, systemic issues that were plaguing Ukraine before the war. This is their one in a millennium chance to really turn the corner and really become a true, huge partner in Europe. I think the population's ready for it. I think they're not going to stand for the corruption that there was before. But all those guys that had their snouts in the trough, they haven't disappeared. And so, in my view, it's EU accession. It's got to be realistic, but also really some tough love using that reconstruction money to force through some of these changes. And you're right, that will then result in a Ukraine that's a hedgehog for Russia, and there's no turning back at that point, regardless of what his territory ultimately winds up looking at.
Take a question here, and then I think there are some hands. We'll go back.
This is our first question from the online audience. This one begins, on behalf of all Ukrainians, I would like to thank Rotary International for supporting Ukraine and our citizens in this hard time. And the question, what do you think? If the war were to be in a frozen stage for some time and Ukraine became a member of NATO in the near future, would Article 5 of the NATO Charter stop Russia from its imperial ambitions to conquer Ukrainian territory in the future?
So there's a long-standing argument that NATO should only have members who have no territorial disputes. And in fact, one of the reasons why some people oppose NATO membership is to say it's very hard to have, particularly a country, even if it's not an active war, that has a territorial dispute, because at what point does the security guarantee that Article 5 gives, which is that an armed attack against one is an armed attack against all, get triggered? In an active war or even in a standoff, it gets triggered at the moment of membership. I take a different view. I think there are ways in which we could craft the security guarantee that is focused on particularly those areas that are not part of an active conflict at the time, maybe expand over time to larger areas, and we can be inventive about this. And it would be the first time NATO brought in West Germany in 1955 without having recognized that East Germany is not part of Article 5 commitments. Same is true for West Berlin. West Berlin was never under NATO protection. It was under American, French, and UK protection. So I think we need to be inventive and not use the excuse, my God, there's an active war going on or a standoff or whatever, and therefore we shouldn't have any security guarantees for Ukraine as such. But it points to the idea that, well, let's just let, which people are saying, let's just let NATO come open up its door in Ukraine to enter tomorrow. Not that easy. These are very significant commitments that we would make as American citizens, by the way, since we are members of NATO, and we ought to understand how to do this. At the same time, we shouldn't use the excuse of something that Ukraine can't help, the fact that it has been invaded now in its 10th year of war, as a reason not to start having a serious discussion about.
So you wouldn't rule it out?
No, I wouldn't rule it out at all.
Those conversations should continue, but very thoughtfully given.
I think it needs a lot of more, it isn't yes or no, it is how. Mm-hmm. It's not, and that's an issue that frankly is more difficult with a country that is in an active conflict or in an active standoff in a conflict than would be if it's like Finland, which is neither, which is why it's easier to bring Finland in than it is the Ukraine. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. That's my bigger point. Some people are using it as an excuse not to talk about NATO membership. I think that's the wrong way to think about it.
John, you also, just from conversations we've had in the past, you would love to see a NATO membership conversation, just significantly more military aid provided to Ukraine now by the United States and the West, as I understand it. What's your sense of what's needed there?
I mean, I think the goal needs to be, as Ivo mentioned earlier, let's give the Ukrainians what they need to get as much territory as they can. And then if it comes to a grinding halt, well, at that point, it's better to have 10 versus 4 versus 3 versus 2. So, yes, and I think in my view, I think we kind of slow rolled some of this help early on, worrying about provoking Putin and all of that. And at the end of the day, Ukrainians wound up getting a lot of what they wanted early on, but at the cost of significantly more lives being lost. I understand that's a controversial issue. And but if I could just pivot for a second, and I don't want to get you off your question. But,
No.
Yeah, as you know, we're here at Rotary, and one of the some of the questions came from Rotarians. Let me just make a plug for Rotary in terms of what we've done for Ukraine, because I think it's an inspiring story, and I think our Rotarians deserve a lot of credit. When this war started, we set up a disaster response fund for Ukraine, and within really a matter of weeks, we raised $15 million for Ukraine from Rotarians around the world. And in addition to that, our Rotary clubs and our Rotarians have been working directly with Ukraine. And anecdotally, we would sort of calculating probably another 15 or 20 million that has gone directly to Ukraine from Rotary clubs. And David Alexander, when he was kicking this off, talked about that group of Rotarians in New Hampshire that raised over $2 million. Well, they called me Christmas, just right before Christmas, from the Polish border, on the Polish-Ukrainian border, saying, we're about to bring in over $2 million worth of stuff into Ukraine. And that's just one story of many, many. And so I think we as Rotarians can be extraordinarily proud of what we've done, how much we've given to Ukraine, and how much we've helped. And it's really shown the power of people, of individual people, to make a difference, which brings us to the additional story of reconstruction. We've talked about the importance of NATO, perhaps of EU accession, but also the importance of civil society and the role that civil society is going to have to play in this reconstruction. Yes, it's private sector money, and ultimately, you were talking about earlier, it's going to have to be private sector money. That's where all the money is. And we'll have to find effective ways of attracting private sector investment into Ukraine. There'll obviously be a lot of bilateral support coming in as well. But civil society is going to play a huge role in this because it's one of the most trusted institutions in Ukraine today. If you look at the Orange Revolution, if you look at Maidan, if you look at now, civil society has an enormously positive reputation in Ukraine. It's one of the few institutions that everybody, before the war, kind of trusted. And proof in the pudding is Rotary. The work that our Rotarians have done in Ukraine has been such that our membership has actually increased since the war started. So think about this. This is a war going on, country being leveled back to the Stone Ages in certain parts. And in spite of that, Ukrainians are saying, I want to join Rotary to give back and to do stuff because they see what we're doing. So I think as we look at reconstruction, it's a whole slew of factors, but I think civil society is going to have to play a huge role in that process. In the bridging process, the question was asked about bringing, because ultimately you do need to bridge this enormous chasm between Ukraine and Russia, right? It's going to take generations. The hatred is intense. But at some point, we've got to get back to stable, peaceful situation. And I think organizations such as Rotary can play a huge role in that. And also being watchdogs to ensure that that money is being properly spent. So sorry to have gone on a tangent, but I did want to make that plug for.
And just as a quick follow-up, I'll get these other questions in, but based on your conversations with Rotarians, both in Ukraine and those who have continued to provide aid to Ukraine, well, what are the biggest humanitarian needs right now?
Well, I mean, it was, clearly it was, at the early war, it was dealing with the refugee crisis. You had 13 million people on the move in a matter of weeks. If you put it in perspective, when the Syrian crisis happened and you had 1 million refugees, it took about 4 years to build. And this happened in a matter of weeks. You had 13 million people on the move, both internally and leaving Ukraine. So the immediate need was dealing with these refugees. It was dealing with basic survival, food, shelter, medicines, etc., ambulances, fire trucks. And that's really what I'd say 95% of the focus has been up till now. And I think going forward, it's going to be the reconstruction, rebuilding society. I think we can't lose sight of the mental health issue. You have, hundreds and thousands of children and young people, Ukrainians in general, PTSD and all the psychological consequences of being of this war. So there's a huge need out there, and I think it's going to shift, obviously, from just survival to rebuilding, reconstruction, obviously, as we go forward.
You have been waiting patiently.
Hi, my name is Joyce. Strategically, they took the ports, which is quite strategic from Putin. Also hearing about a Minsk agreement that was agreed to by the president of Ukraine. He's acting on the...
I'm going to have you hold your microphone a little closer, if you don't mind, just so we can... There we go.
Putin has strategically taken all their ports. And so at this point, it's very calculating, and he tripled them by the ports alone, if not Kiev. The other one, we're hearing about a Minsk agreement of the previous Ukraine president that he's acting on. Third one we're hearing is the International Monetary Fund. He wants to split it. He's courting India. He's courting China to split the monetary fund. So I think it's damning, but what I don't understand is after Colin Powell was there, why didn't they become part of NATO?
Very fully got it. Ivo, do you want to take a crack at it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I mean, yes, they have taken the ports in the Sea of Azov, but they haven't taken all the ports, including the most important port in Odessa. Ukraine retains an access to the Black Sea. The Black Sea itself is dominated by Russian military forces, as it always has. And frankly, the Turks have not been particularly helpful in enabling reinforcements or just international navies to gain access to the Black Sea. Only Black Sea littoral countries are allowed to have access to them by the Turks, which of course control access to the Black Sea and the Sea of Bosporus. But Odessa still is an open port, and indeed all the grain exports that are being done under the deal that the UN has negotiated between Ukraine and Russia are happening mostly through the ports of Odessa. So I think there's a limit. He hasn't achieved what he wanted to achieve, which was to strangle Ukraine economically, and it hasn't. It certainly devastated Ukraine economically, but the international aid that has come, including the IMF, which has just approved $17+ billion of direct budgetary support, has made it possible for Ukraine to not only to survive. And as I mentioned, if you go to Kyiv today, that is not a city that is. I mean, it's a city that is suffering. It's the people that is suffering, but it is a city that has shown resilience in its capacity to survive, including the electricity network, which the Russians got very, very, very close to destroying in late fall, early winter. It's now highly resilient, in part because of all the generators that were being brought into the country, but also the decentralization of the newly built electricity system, which means that it's no longer possible to target a few critical electrical nodes and transformers to take out the electricity system. So there's an ingenuity on the part of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian way of doing business that has made it just difficult, if not impossible, for Putin to achieve militarily or economically what he had hoped to achieve. And as this war goes on, and as the West continues to support, importantly, Ukraine, and civil society helps in the way it is doing it, they're going to find that it's going to be increasingly difficult to bring the country to its knees, and that Russians are more likely to suffer the consequences than Ukraine, as it should be, because they're the victims and not the other way around.
I have a question right here in the front, and then I think there were a few hands in back that I want to make sure we don't forget.
Hi, sorry for that. My question, we are used to look at Russia as a monolithic country, the same way we used to look at the Soviet Union. It was a big country. It was very easy to deal with the entire Soviet Union as such. But how strong, do you have a sense, is the Russian Federation? Because we have signs here and there that there are parts of Russia that are not very much, they feel like colonies from Moscow, which in a way the Soviet republics were more or less that. And John and I had a chance to see that, what you always say, John, when Ukraine became independent, the Minister of Finance of this large country had 9 employees, right? So my question is, how strong do we think that Russia really is? And would there be a possibility that the country as such would, that Russia would become a lot smaller?
So Russia is an empire, it's not a nation. It remains, even the Russia of today is a country that incorporates many different nationalities and backgrounds, from the Tatars to the Chechens to people in Siberia. I think at the moment Russian central control of the Federation, its ability to control every part of the Federation is quite strong. I mean, they've been at it for quite a long time to use the forces of economic and military and political leverage. The power is in the hands of the people who are closest to Moscow in all of those places, and they've also demonstrated that they're willing to do what it takes to keep the Federation whole, as they did in 2 wars in Chechnya, where they showed what they were able to do: flatten the country, flatten cities. Grozny was literally flattened in a way that Mariupol was, and it wasn't exactly the same. They've been doing it for a very long time. And so, in essence, the Federation remains strong because of that. But as you weaken the core, who knows? There is this question of whether Russia itself ultimately can survive, because it is just as big much of an empire rather than a nation state. I don't think we're there yet. I'm not quite sure that should be the objective of our policy. I don't think that's where we want to go necessarily, because it does create new senses of insecurity. When I think we want to build a system that is based on mutual security, where one recognizes that I can be secure because my neighbor is secure, rather than I am secure because my neighbor is insecure. I think we're fortunate in the United States to have 2 neighbors where that actually is part of how we think about it. It's how people in Europe think about it. It's increasingly how people in Africa, certainly since decolonization, have understood that recognizing borders and not changing them is how you maintain your security. The problem may be internal, but it's not going to be cross-border, and you want to think about it in those terms. So when you start poking the internal stability of a country, you're creating new tensions that I think we can do without, at least for the moment.
Let's take a couple of questions from our online audience as well. Perhaps you could share 2 with us to keep going, and then we'll keep moving things around.
Sure. The first question is, what are the limits on American involvement through arms supply and intelligence collaboration? And to John specifically, given your view of Putin's deep psychological motivation, how does that inform your assessment of limits?
Maybe I can tackle the psychological piece, you would handle the intelligence. Yeah, I think, just to go back even to this whole issue of territory, I do think within the Russian Federation, there's some pretty profound tensions. It's been there for a long time. A lot of the natural resources and the wealth in the Russian Federation are coming east of the Ural Mountains. And they're not ethnic Russians, that these autonomous republics that control a lot of that wealth are not ethnic Russians. It's largely non-ethnic Russians who were sent to Ukraine early on in the war. You weren't seeing a whole lot of soldiers from Moscow and Petersburg going, and they called up the mobilization. It's Moscow and Petersburg is what cleared out. So I do think, who knows, Yvonne, I think you're absolutely right. They've got a very good command and control system. But if, Ukraine were, let's say, to have a resounding counteroffensive and push Russia back to February 23rd, who knows? But I would suspect that would trigger a bit of a seismic earthquake within the Federation, and perhaps could, start triggering some of these inherent tensions that they have, because, as you said, it is an empire, and just as the Soviet Union was. In terms of this deep psychological thing, yeah, it's what's been driving Putin. I was never that convinced it was largely NATO. I mean, look what happened when Finland joined NATO. You watch Russian TV and they're like, yeah, okay, the Finnish people decided to join NATO. The place didn't fall apart. They kind of took it in strides. I never felt there was really a concern about NATO as much. It was just this very deep psychological issue of getting Ukraine for a whole slew of reasons, a lot of them being historical, emotional, et cetera, and Putin's own worldview of what Russia was, what Russia should be, and what Ukraine isn't in his mind. So I think these emotional issues are extraordinarily important. But on the intelligence, the weapons?
So I think the fundamental distinction between the fundamental limit on what the United States ought to be doing in terms of supporting Ukraine directly is the direct involvement of U.S. military forces. That's the line. Early on, I was against the no-fly zone, which a lot of people were calling for, because a no-fly zone would have required American or NATO military aircraft to get directly involved or be potentially directly involved in the conflict. But to the other side of that line, I don't think there's a lot of limit that there isn't much other than, I don't think we should be providing nuclear weapons to Ukraine. I don't think anybody's asking for them, so that's a good thing. And we have provided an incredible amount, not only of weaponry, $40 billion worth of capabilities, but also of intelligence. And the intelligence has been extraordinary. The kind of intelligence that we have on Russian capabilities, on what's happening on the day-to-day is quite remarkable, and we're sharing an awful lot of it with the Ukrainians. I mean, little doubt that Ukraine would not be able to have achieved what it has militarily up to this point, but for the intelligence that we are provided. And there is no doubt that what it will be able to achieve in the counteroffensive, if and when it comes, will be primarily because of American and to some extent Western military and intelligence aid, and importantly, training. Counteroffensive has 12 brigades worth of forces that have not been involved in the fight, 9 of which have been trained by the United States and the United Kingdom, all of them in Germany. These are totally fresh troops. These are not troops that have been involved in the fighting so far. They're led often by very young but very experienced guys who are going to be leading this new counteroffensive fight, and it is that kind of capability that has been provided. I think that's the right capability because the other one, the direct military involvement of the United States and NATO, I think needs to be reserved for the eventuality that perhaps Putin decides, for whatever psychological reason, that he wants to escalate further and use nuclear weapons himself, in which case I think all bets are off on what we should be doing. But it's his knowledge that we might become involved directly militarily, and he would lose that war immediately, that prevents him from doing those kinds of, to think twice before moving in that direction. So there is a limit to what we can and should be giving, but as long as you stay to the other side of that limit, I'm pretty bullish on giving them everything they need. And I think we have given them an incredible amount that when the history and the story is written about what we have provided them in terms of intelligence, but also in terms of weaponry that we may not have been talking about openly and publicly, will be regarded as quite remarkable.
I know we're coming up on full time. John, I want you to get in.
I just wanted to make one last comment, and I'm interested also in getting Ivo's take on this, is that I'm a bit concerned that you're getting in the States, since we're in the United States, maybe perhaps focus on this a bit, a little bit of Ukraine fatigue, parts of the Republican Party talking about how we no blank checks and all of that. And I've always felt that we need to do a better, those that want to support Ukraine and feel the United States should do a much better job with our elevator speech. Why is this important to somebody in a small town in southern Illinois, beyond the strategy, the international world order, And I think that message, I don't think, has been nearly as refined or developed as it should be. So, what would be, Ivo, your elevator speech to normal American that says, well, first of all, there's this myth out there that we've spent $200 billion on Ukraine. That's absolutely false. We've spent about $76 billion to date, $46 billion on weapons, and another 30 on humanitarian and budget support. I think $113 billion has been appropriated, but not fully spent. So we're nowhere near this $200 billion figure that other channel has been propagating for a while. But I do think there's, in some ways, we're at a point now where we need a really crisp, good story about why the United States should continue to support Ukraine. And we're only giving what, 0.37% of our GDP to Ukraine. It's a lot of money, 76 billion, but it's not big if you look at it in terms of our GDP and what it might cost us in the future if, let's say, Putin were to win this war. It's in some ways, it's like spending $5 now to avoid spending 100 further down the road. But Ivo, I know I'm not the questioner here, but what will be your elevator speech to the American public about why, this is money well spent?
Well, first, let's make clear that the American public has been behind this war in very large numbers.
To those that are questioning.
But I think it's important. A year into this war, American support across the board, Republican and Democrat, there's differences between the two, but across the board has been remarkable. And European public support has been even more remarkable, because while we tend to go and start screaming when gas prices go up by 15 cents or 20 cents at the pump, Germany has literally weaned itself off Russian fossil fuel completely in a year. 42% of gas consumption by Germany came from Russia. Today it is 0. It's a remarkable achievement.
Nobody thought that was going to happen.
No, nobody did. But it didn't come without cost. It meant that the thermostat was a little lower, that the industry was a little less efficient and had to pay a little bit more, that inflation was a little higher, and yet 70+% of the Germans continue to think that this was the right thing. So that, I think, part of it is we have a tendency in the United States to listen to the loudest voices who usually are wrong. But in this case, the majority of Americans are right. Why are they therefore on that? Why do they believe that? I think the argument is sort of twofold. One is it's sort of a principle. The understanding that if you start to live in a world in which bullies can get away with bullying, in this case, using military force to change borders and to say, what's mine is mine and what yours is mine,